Alright folks, this is the second Welcome to My Brain. We're looking at rhetorical analysis for this one. So the first one, synthesis, is going to be like way longer just because there was all that reading of the sources and all that goes with it, right? But this one should be shorter. I mean, granted, these essays are 40 minutes long, but because the video is going to be like a step-by-step explanation, it's going to be a little bit longer than what the given time frame is going to be. So this is from 2008. This is Form B. And what Form B basically means is I mean, that's still now, I guess, but back then they had like two different versions of the AP exam because they were experimenting with things like different forms of rhetorical readings. Like one would be more actually literary than maybe like a speech or what have you. So they're kind of like, figuring out what they exactly wanted to work out into. And then later when you get to like 2010 and on, it becomes more like equalized. And they're like, okay, we finally got it in terms of like the new version that they would like to work with here. So this is 2008, still has a little bounce between here. But how I want to approach this one is I want to read the entire piece actually and go over paragraph by paragraph what are some things I'm noticing in terms of the writing choices that I could put into my little list over here. So for this video, I'm going to go over soapstone, I'm going to go over the trends of devices that I saw, meaning like some of the motifs that the author has gone over, and just talk a little bit about like rhetorical modes, figurative, and writing slash structural stuff, like these sort of categories that we want to build our body paragraphs into, right? So we'll look at 2008, and I'll just read it verbatim, right, word for word. Read a following passage from America Needs Its Nerds by Leonid Friedman. Then write an essay in which you analyze how Friedman develops his argument. So this is super broad, right? Because all we are left with here is how he develops his arguments. So we need to figure out what his argument is in the first place, and at the same time, we need to figure out what are some choices that he has regarding this here. Now, it's titled America Needs Its Nerds. I'm assuming it's an argument about how America should emphasize more on nerds, how they should kind of like uphold the nerd status and title more. So let's see what happens in here. Without further ado, a couple of critiques, right? So this is from the New York Times back in 1990. So it's kind of like modern-ish. It's not like something that's way dated in terms of writing here. So I usually look at the endnotes or just anything prior that I can use as information, so that kind of like guides my reading as to what it might be saying or expecting from me here. So the first paragraph says, there's something very wrong with the system of values in a society that only has derogatory terms like nerd and geek for the intellectually curious and academically serious. So already I'm noticing this, right? I'm noticing this is sort of like juxtaposition slash dichotomy happening in America where intellect is synonymous with negative, spelling issues, with negative terminology. So in this case, I'm also thinking about like diction, for example, right? I'm thinking the fact that we have these words such as nerd or geek, right? Nerd and geek, right? But it's interesting because what are these terms suggesting? People who are learned, people who are actually educated, and it supposedly has a negative connotation. So in this case, I'm thinking about diction and connotation as well. Next paragraph, a geek, according to Webster's New World Dictionary, is a street performer who shocks the public by biting off heads of live chickens. It is a telling fact about our language and our culture that someone dedicated to pursuit of knowledge is compared to a freak biting the head off of a live chicken. So in this case, I'm thinking more about diction as well, but this time I'm thinking about denotation. And again, I'm playing jazz in the background because the static of the mic. I don't know if it helps, but whatever. So I'm thinking about how geek is defined as a fairly negative thing, right? And using this, he sets the precedence of the term. Meaning, like, geek isn't simply flattering whatsoever. It comes from a pretty negative description and image as well. Speaking of image, I can use imagery. It might not help. I feel like it's like a small example of imagery, but it does show how the geek is like, it demonstrates how the geek is this vile and outcasted identity. Identity. So this is what I'm doing, right? When I'm doing any sort of annotations of a reading, I'm thinking about how every paragraph has some sort of device or intentional writing choice. Because it does. Everything has intention, right? It's not random paragraphs. Everything has a little package of a message there. Even at a prestigious academic institution like Harvard, anti-intellectualism is rampant. Many students are ashamed to admit, even to their friends, how much they study. Although most students try to keep up their grades, there is a minority of undergraduates for whom pursuing knowledge is the top priority during their years at Harvard. Nerds are ostracized while athletes are idolized. So I can kind of use like ethos here, right? And using the ethos of Harvard, for example, even here, the nerd is looked down upon. Few are willing to admit to the sort of try-hard, I mean, it's an informal term, but try-hard behaviorism that is typically expected of Ivy League schools. So it's kind of ironic that, that happens. Speaking of irony, well, here we go. Irony and ethos as well. Even Harvard has its bias against the nerd. So we got a lot to work with, right? For those of you who feel like you can't squeeze out anything from these rhetorical devices, I'm going to go through this and look at these different types of writing choices. I got like the more figurative stuff. I got the more like literary stuff. I have the more, rhetorical mode stuff. I'm going to try to find as many as I can from these different categories so you can kind of see how to approach these paragraphs. I'll be honest, this jazz kind of loud. Turn it off. It's kind of bothering me. So the next paragraph says, the same thing happens in U.S. elementary and high schools. Children who prefer to read books rather than play football, prefer to build model airplanes rather than get wasted at parties with their classmates, become social outcasts. Ostracized for their intelligence and refusal to conform to society's anti-intellectual values, many are deprived of a chance to learn adequate social skills and acquire good communication tools. So I'm looking at the structure here where this author has this little parallel structure, right? Prefer to rather than, and they become social outcasts, those who prefer to do this versus the other. So I'm looking at this parallelism of prefer to, what did it say again? It was rather than. To show how ridiculous almost, well actually I should put the explanations on the other side. Ridiculousness of how like almost like good behavior is punished and outcasted, which is kind of ridiculous, right? Because it's like they emphasize so much in schools, but then later when you actually do the thing that they ask you to do, you are not seen as positive. I'm put some more rows down here. I'm doing it like per paragraph basically. Rows below, how many got left? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I need 5 more. Goddamn. Okay. They're all short though, so it's all good. Row below, insert row below, and I think one more. Insert row below. So we have a one-line paragraph which exists in writing. Like this is for like dramatic effect and what do you call it? Yeah, that's about it. Dramatic effect. Enough is enough. Now, if you remember, if you're part of my advisory group, we had this thing called Diet Coke, and this is exactly what it is, right? It's a repetition of enough separated by a word in between. And so what it does is it's a form of repetition, right? And repetition is basically like tautology, where we have an emphasis on this idea of enough is enough. Author is almost like showing a tone of frustration. Author is kind of like, how dare they? So we can even put tone here. It shows frustration through their emphasis. Frustration. Nerds and geeks must stop being ashamed of who they are. It is high time to face the persecutors who haunt the bright kid with thick glasses from kindergarten to the grave. For America's sake, the anti-intellectual values that pervade our society must be fought. We have a couple of figurative language stuff in here. Persecutors. Wow, that's a strong word here. So we have the word persecutors. Persecutors. And we also, what? Persecute. Oh, my bad. I missed it. You there. Oh. We have a little bit of imagery where we have like the kid with the thick glasses, right? So it's a little bit of a caricature. Caricature. And we also have from kindergarten to the grave. It's a little bit of hyperbole, but it's kind of true, right? Where these kids are being like, not kids eventually, but they get harassed their whole lives, essentially, the nerds, right? So persecutors might be a little bit of a, I mean, I guess it could be hyperbole too, but making comparison where maybe it's a metaphor. The intensity of situation. We have imagery of the nerds with thick glasses And we also have hyperbole to the grave, just to show how extreme it really is. We have the next paragraph. There are very few countries in the world where anti-intellectual runs as high in popular culture as it does in the U.S. and most industrialized nations. Not least of all our economic rivals in East Asia, a kid who studies hard is lauded and held up as an example to other students. So in this case, we have a little bit more juxtaposition going on here. We're looking at one country versus another. Juxtaposition. I mean, if you wanted to compare and contrast, you can do that too, right? Compare and contrast. U.S. versus, let's say East Asia in this case, right? Huge difference culturally. Maybe explains difference in education. I don't know, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I think it does. In many parts of the world, university professorships are the most prestigious and materially rewarding positions, but not in America, where average professional ball players are much more respected and better paid than faculty members of the best universities. So it's kind of like, again, a little bit more logos ethos, right? Where we're comparing the prestige of professors in one country versus the other, demonstrates the U.S.'s views on education, perhaps. Last paragraph, author says, how can a country where typical parents are ashamed of their daughter studying mathematics instead of going dancing, or of their son reading Weber while his friends play baseball, be expected to compete in the technology race with Japan or remain a leading political and cultural force in Europe? I'm seeing this big rhetorical question here. So I'm looking at a rhetorical question asking, like, well, how can we? I don't know, maybe we can't. So we got a rhetorical question going on. How long can America remain a world-class power if we constantly emphasize social skills and physical prowess over academic achievement and intellectual ability? So this one here, another, it ends with two rhetorical questions, right? And maybe the author does that intentionally ending with questions for reader to ponder. Kind of thinking like, well, actually that's a question. How can we compete in a world that doesn't respect nerds and so forth there? So I got a pretty good breakdown of this piece in terms of what devices I can use. I got a ton to pull from, right? From paragraph to paragraph. And really, when we're doing rhetorical analysis, we just need like the rule of three, which is like at least three devices really clearly used. But you'll notice I have a lot of like repeaters, right? And that's perfect. I want repeaters in terms of what devices I'm seeing because I can cram them into one paragraph. So my topic sentence deals with like juxtaposition, for example, right? Well, I had a couple of those. I had juxtaposition over here. I had juxtaposition in, where is it? This paragraph here, and I can kind of make some comparisons, some combinations between paragraphs and paragraphs of what seems related with each other, right? So it's always nice to do a little breakdown of all the devices throughout, because if you can kind of load up your paragraphs with more than one example of the device from one point to another, it's always big brain stuff to do. Now, I need soapstone, though, because my soapstone will eventually contribute to my intro paragraph and my thesis. So I need to figure out, okay, what is this piece really saying? Who's speaking? What's going on, right? Now, for speaker, this is the big problem that people have. It's not Leonid Friedman, technically. I mean, he is the person writing this piece, but speaker is more about, like, what's his identity, right? What kind of voice he's speaking with, what kind of ethos does he have, right? I'm thinking about, okay, New York Times, he's probably literate, educated. I'd be surprised if he wasn't educated speaking on a topic like this, right? I'm also thinking he's critical, right? He's very critical tone. I can say that for tone as well, but that for tone. But he seems to have a lot to say about this sort of issue in the U.S. regarding how we don't put enough on education. We chastise our nerds here. May have been a nerd himself. Recounting experiences, maybe? Because it seems like he's talking about some very, like, not personal, but things that he may have gone through in terms of, like, what have you, childhood or whatever, right? Like common things that nerds would go through altogether. He seems worldly because he's making comparisons between like Europe and Asia to the US. So comparing US with rest of world, meaning he's not like isolated to US in terms of views. He's definitely like looking at the global scale here, right? Occasion, I'm thinking about, well, America's lacking. America is lacking in education, which it still is, but what are we gonna do about that? Maybe there's something rising in terms of like this animosity towards nerds. It's the 90s, by the way. It's kind of true, actually. It's funny because the 90s was when, like, you know, it had, like, the dot-com boom and everything, computers were, like, rising and all that, but still there's, like, a very anti-nerd type of cultural phenomenon in movies, in popular culture, so forth and so on. And maybe just looking at how world is moving ahead of US, because the rest of the world was still developing industrially and everything, right? But suddenly they're catching up and surpassing the US, and the author's kind of like, whoa, we're going to lose our footing soon if we don't keep up and catch up here. Audience, US citizens, obviously, right? We're looking at educators, maybe, because we need to encourage these nerds in our schools. Maybe he's criticizing, like, mainstream media and how mainstream media has been, like, perpetuating this idea of, like, the jock who is the Chad of everything, and how you know, the nerd is always like second fiddle essentially here. What else? What other audience members can we think about? Nerds themselves. A supporter, right? I'm advocating for you. I'm on your side. And nerds are like, thank you, Leonid Friedman, as I play Dungeons and Dragons. Maybe slide a little smaller. Purpose. Well, he's trying to convince readers that nerds are necessary to thrive. He's trying to have the audience re-evaluate their views on nerds, go against, again, yeah, mainstream media. Maybe he's trying to, not what do you call it, advocate and uphold the nerd status. Bring, yeah, awareness of the rising issue of falling behind because we don't support our nerds. And lastly, message against anti-intellectualism, because in this country it seems like if you bring something intellectually up, people are going to criticize you like, hey, how dare you sound smart? And it's like, what? Why not? It's like, well, you sound pompous and pretentious and a nerd. And you're thinking, no, I'm just trying to have a critical conversation, you know, chill. Subjects: education, nerds, animosity, global competition, what else? Ostracizing. I guess like terminology, because he is kind of like trying to have us rethink the word terminology. I think he focuses, well, maybe he goes through this education system. Maybe let's put education in system, because he talks about like this whole like professor system and like kids in kindergarten, etc., etc. What else? Maybe like idolization of sports, or I guess like, I don't know, I won't say manly, because it's not exactly manly stuff, but it kind of has like that tinge to it, right? Because he mentions sports oftentimes. Idolization of extracurriculars? Extracurriculars, something like that. God damn it, did I miss it? Oh, you can't plural that? Alright, fine, whatever. Tone, critical, concerned. I'm thinking, what else? Questioning, especially towards the end. Annoyed, because he's kind of like, what the hell? Why are the nerds being picked on? But he knows why they're being picked on. Surprised, I guess, because it's kind of like, huh? Why are we anti-smart? That's kind of crazy. And disappointed? I mean, kind of, yeah, right? He's definitely like, damn, I can't believe our country really turned out like this. So these are all the things I can put into my intro paragraph. This kind of combination of speaker, occasion, audience, purpose, subject, and tone. You put all this together in your intro, about 3-4 sentences tops, and you have yourself a pretty clear essay altogether. So this is a quick run through in terms of, I mean, it's not quick because this should be happening in your heads, but this is kind of like me just, again, talking about what I'm thinking of as I'm analyzing, right? But this should be happening in your head roughly about 10-15 minutes, and the rest of it, boom, go into the writing process. You really only have like 25-30ish minutes to write this, so this gotta be fast. Like, if you get a harder reading, because this one's pretty decent, like phrased and all that. But if you have like a long speech, for example, or when it's a little bit more antiquated, you really gotta start picking out some of the trends that you're seeing in the author's writing, because you can't maybe do as extensive as I did here, but you gotta try your best to pull out as much as you can. So one thing I definitely encourage people to do for the paragraphs, you might want one paragraph on the rhetorical modes, right? So one on like the logos, ethos, pathos, kairos stuff, just because it's like easy to look at the structural kind of build up of the entire thing, or like these chunks of these examples here. Maybe look for a paragraph on the figurative stuff. So if the author is trying to be more abstract, metaphysical, these creative writing choices, go ahead and look for a paragraph on that. And then later, lastly, maybe a paragraph on the writing choices in terms of like tone, diction, connotations, parallelisms, juxtapositions, anaphora, epiphora, whatever, stuff like that, to look at the kind of like the building of a good argument. These are the 3 different methods I would try to categorize and bin for my bodies here. So you can do all 3, you can do 2 of them. It's up to you. You can mix and match them as well, because they are related in many ways, but it's just whatever works in your time frame there. So if you want to practice these, really just annotate, right? I would say if you want to practice rhetorical analysis, get a bunch of like speeches and stuff and just look through them, kind of figure out like, oh, this is here. Oh, this is here, etc., etc., etc. And just make sure you have like a good eye then for devices, and you should be okay then for that AP exam.